Nigeria's total public debt rose to 46.25 trillion naira, about $103.1 billion in 2022, from 39.56 trillion naira a year earlier, as the government ramped up borrowing to fund its budget deficit. The country's Debt Management Office said Nigeria's debt-to-GDP ratio stood at 23.2% in 2022, compared with 22.47%, which is still within the country's self-imposed limit of 40%. In January, the head of the DMO, Patient Oniha, said the total public debt could rise to 77 trillion naira this year if the National Assembly grants approval for a central bank temporary advance to government to be swapped to bonds, coupled with new borrowings to fund the 2023 budget. At the end of January, the House of Representatives also approved the president's request for an additional 1 trillion naira loan from the CBN to fund its 2022 supplementary budget. Joining me to look at this now is Cees Harmon. He's a senior financial markets analyst from Nairametrics. Cees, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yes, my pleasure.
Okay, so let's start with this. We've seen Nigeria's debt climb steadily over the past several years. And when you look at the numbers, an increase from 39.56 trillion in 2021 to 46.25 trillion in 2022. What picture does this paint for you? What does this tell you, especially as we keep in mind the struggle for Nigeria to recover from COVID-19, as well as the consequences of the Russia-Ukraine crisis that we've witnessed in the last year as well?
Well, the country's debt continues to move northward, and it hasn't abated. In fact, it has worsened over the past, say, 8 years. Remember, especially for foreign debt, Nigeria was essentially debt-free. I'm talking about foreign debt as of 2007. Just a little, that was the country's burden at that time. But over the years, under President Goodluck Jonathan, it started going up gradually and going up. But it had a steep rise, or it has had a steep rise under President Buhari, and for obvious reasons. Under the previous presidents, the price of oil, which is Nigeria's mainstay, had a hefty price to it. The price at the time went up to $140 per barrel. And at that time, the country was producing something in the neighborhood of 2.2 million barrels per day. Under President Goodluck Jonathan, it dropped to, as of 2013, 2014, it had dropped to around 115. But by the time President Goodluck Jonathan, or former President Goodluck Jonathan, was leaving office, it had fallen to about $70 per barrel. And that is where President Buhari took over from. And ever since then, oil theft has exacerbated things. And that is Nigeria's main source of revenue. And so that has got us into the situation we find ourselves in today.
Okay, so one thing that the Debt Management Office pointed out is that in terms of Nigeria's debt burden, the debt to GDP ratio, which at the time was about 22.47%, is now 23.2%. Again, emphasizing it's still within the country's band, the country's target band of this. But in terms of measuring sustainability, particularly debt sustainability, is the debt to GDP ratio what we should be looking at? Is that the right ratio for us to measure how sustainable Nigeria's debt is?
I would say no. Many other experts also say no. Why? In other countries, developed countries, including the US, big economies like China, they have much higher debt to GDP ratio, but they can sustain it because they have income. Those economies are thriving. And so they have the income to meet up with their debt obligations. Not so with Nigeria. We are having low revenue. In fact, Nigeria has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. which is not sustainable considering our debt level. So that 23.1% we're talking about is it's not sustainable for Nigeria, even though by international standards it's sustainable. But we can't hold on to that because we're not generating enough revenues to meet our debt obligations.
So let's look at the 2022 budget proposal. So the budget deficit was 3.39% of GDP, while that of 2023 represents about 4.78% of Nigeria's GDP. So this one is actually higher. It's higher than the 3% threshold set by the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2007. And there have been a lot of people who've made noise about the fact that we seem to keep pushing the envelope when it comes to this particular aspect of the budget deficit. What implications do you think this has in terms of us pushing this envelope and continue to see this increase in the budget deficit as we've seen over the past few cycles?
It will only impoverish Nigerians more. Why so? Well, Nigeria will have to pay more to service her debt. And in paying more, monies that should have been used to fund sectors such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, those things that grow the economy, those things that make that you can call development. Yes, they are going to be starved because of debt service, and as a result of that, when the country is having high debt ratio, you find out that even foreign investors will find it difficult because they look at the country as an unstable country. And when they find out that the country is unstable, or when they perceive that the country is unstable, it makes them hold back their funds because this is not a place, it's a country of uncertainty, a country that is struggling to pay its debt. Of course, Nigeria is not yet struggling, but we know the extreme that we go to have our debt service. And so investors look at all of that and it may hold them back, which further impoverishes the country. So the debt problem is actually a very serious one, and you can't overlook it.
We'll get to whether or not Nigeria is struggling in a moment. But when you put everything together, the high debt burden, the profile that we have, Nigeria also having chronic revenue shortage, as you mentioned earlier, and all of it, what it leads to, which is a bloated budget deficit. The implication is that at the end of the day, we're going to go back into this vicious cycle of more borrowing. But then also, we know that the administration of President Muhammadu Buhari literally has a few weeks left. And now all this pressure is going to fall on President-elect Bola Tinubu's administration. What options do you think are available for the next administration when it comes to borrowing? Is there potential for them to stop that cycle? Or are we really needing to face reality and understanding that we're going to be in this borrow sort of bust cycle for a few years to come?
Like we mentioned at the onset, the country's debt burden has been growing, and there is no indication that it may stop because Nigeria is not generating enough to meet her debt burden. So, number one, the president-elect Bola Ahmed Tinubu can do this. He has to renegotiate Nigeria's debt, actually. He has to renegotiate it for a longer term so that the country will have a breather and will be able to tackle, at least to say, invest in critical infrastructure, critical services of government that will get the economy on the path of growth. Otherwise, we'll find ourselves in that vicious cycle. Number two, corruption and mismanagement of funds, government, public funds, is not helping the country. And even countries, our development partners who grant us the loans, at some point in time will begin to have a rethink. In fact, China, at the time, sometime in 2021, 2022, China was actually holding back loans to Nigeria, development loans to Nigeria, and it's because of many people said it was because of fears that China is having, that the debt issue is becoming a serious burden on the country. So Nigeria really needs to reduce corruption and mismanagement of funds. And thirdly, the country has to reduce the cost of governance. It is very high. In fact, some people might think it is lopsided. A former CBN governor once said that there was this arm of government that was gulping as much as more than 20% of the country's GDP. And that is fairly high. How true is that? It was disputed by the government then, but those are some of the issues. We really need to reduce our cost of governance. It's high.
You know, you mentioned China, so let's talk about China now, because earlier this week we heard reports that the China Exim Bank had rejected Nigeria's request for a $22 billion loan. The House of Representatives then approved a counter request for another loan from the Chinese Development Bank at about $973 million. So the rejected loan was intended to fund the Nigerian Railway Modernization Project's Kaduna to Kano segment. Now, the Federal Ministry of Finance had requested modifications to the financing proposal for the Nigerian Railway project due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which apparently led to China Exim Bank withdrawing its support for the project. Aside from that, there were also concerns about Nigeria's ability to repay the loan. So the first part I want you to answer is this. Is Nigeria really using these loans for the right projects? When we look at it, we've heard about communication projects, we've heard about modernizing railways. Many people are saying that we're putting money into things that are not sustainable. So is Nigeria really plugging the right holes, using the loans for the right things that in some way will pay for themselves? What do you think?
Well, some analysts will say, no, Nigeria is not putting money into the right investments. I'll give you an example. A few weeks, I was talking to an expert, the chief economist of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he said, he made mention of the fact that, take for example, the airport, at the time, was it just recently, the federal government spent some 500 million in getting the airports, or modernizing the airports. That is Abuja, Lagos, Kano, those places, modernizing those airports. But what are those airports bringing in? The airports can't
pay for the project.
Not only they can't pay for the projects, they are not bringing the revenues. You know, when you pump money into development projects, let those projects bring the revenue. There should be a return. But when the project is not bringing any returns, then it makes it, like he said, a dead project. And Nigeria has many dead assets, in like to mention a few, Ajaokuta, like this airport project. And if the rail, of course, you remember Nigeria has spent so much under this administration, Nigeria has spent so much on getting the trains to work, which is very good for the economy, which is very good for the country. But how much are those trains bringing? Are those railways bringing? They are not yet optimal, because if you look at Itape-Warri train service, it's not working. If you look at Kaduna, Abuja, it's not working. It makes it difficult to pay back those loans. And those are some of the things China may be looking at and say, come again. These people are not making from what we are, from the loans we are giving them, or from the projects we are giving them to develop this infrastructure and that infrastructure. Why are we still giving? How sure are we they'll be able to repay us? And usually, like you said, it will actually turn back to a vicious cycle.
Yes.
That is going to pour again and again and again. So we really need to be smarter in channeling our borrowed funds to the right projects.
So let me follow up with that, because at this point now, the question is, is China or anyone else who has loaned Nigeria money, any institutional lender, whoever it may be, or anyone who could be in line to loan Nigeria money, are they right to be concerned about the country's ability to repay its debts? Because we know that in October 2021, Moody's Investors Services pointed out that Nigeria's current fiscal challenges place it at a risk of default. We've seen the situation with our neighbor Ghana, the second largest economy in West Africa. We've seen where the restructuring talks with Zambia are at this point in time. We've seen Egypt as well, going back to the IMF as well, looking for a loan. We've seen the situation with Kenya, the largest economy in East Africa. We are seeing the pointers and the red flags with many major economies here on the continent, but Nigeria itself hasn't really made too many comments in terms of either debt forgiveness, debt restructuring, or even just looking at how it borrows. So is everybody right to be concerned about Nigeria's ability to repay its loans?
Nigeria has succeeded in repaying her loans at least up to the moment. But to answer that question, I will ask you again. What is our main source of revenue? Oil. How much do we get from oil, considering the theft, considering the price of oil on the international market? These are unstable indices that we're talking about. So it questions our ability, since crude oil is the only means or the major means by which we can generate revenue. And that means of generating revenue is actually under threat. So the foreign partners actually have a reason to feel jittery, to feel skeptical about Nigeria's ability to pay back loans in the long run. Especially, you can cite their experiences with Zambia, Ghana, a host of other African nations. So they have a reason to feel.
So do we have a situation where before it becomes a crisis situation, like what we've witnessed in Kenya, Egypt, Zambia, and Ghana, as I've said, Nigeria should be starting some talks with the IMF? Should we be at a point in time where we're already approaching the World Bank, the IMF, for some kind of loans to give us some breathing space? Have we reached that point? Or should we continue down this line we're continuing down?
Well, Nigeria can't get out of this situation without getting more loans. We need the loans, but we need to invest smarter. Now, we're talking about sectors of the economy that are likely to bring revenue. And what are those sectors? Of course, we need agriculture, even though we have not been talking about exports. We have not been getting so much from agriculture, but at least some of the monies we spend abroad much of it includes food import. So we need to be able to feed ourselves. Just to give you an example, some 2020, 2021, 2022, Nigeria has been importing palm oil to the tune of $500 million. We talk about corn, maize. We need maize for our agricultural products, our chicken feeds, you name them. We talk about wheat to make bread. All of these things, although Nigeria may not be the right soil for the growing of wheat, but we need agriculture. We need to be able to feed ourselves. We need to be able to feed ourselves by producing enough rice. So investing in agriculture will be a good one. But then we look at manufacturing. Manufacturing is suffering because of
electricity.
Yes, in fact, they find it difficult to survive in the manufacturing sector because of taxes. Those fiscal issues, they are actually hurting we can explain much on this, but probably because of your time.
Yes.
But the area we can invest in and get some returns include ICT, broadband investment, so that, because that's where Nigeria is where we are beginning to see income. For the sake of advertisement, I don't want to name names, but Nigeria's fintech have been doing well, and they have been actually generating some good money.
Yeah, we saw that last year with the non-oil revenue that was coming in. But Cees, I want us to move forward because, as you said, of time. But let's go to what's happening between the federal government and the CBN, which many people are concerned about. So now we know that the federal government has asked for a 40-year securitization of the Ways and Means advances. Now, this is yet to be approved by the National Assembly, but there's a division from analysts. While some claim that this is a complete disregard for the CBN Act and the CBN cannot act alone and this cannot be ignored, and strongly even condemn the request, others are saying, what do you expect the CBN to do? Should it simply fold the arms when the country needs saving? Is this a very dangerous line that you think Nigeria may be wanting to cross, or is it really the only option for the country?
On the one hand, that is the only option for the country. On the other hand, it's a dangerous line because, by upping Nigeria's debt to 77 trillion naira, as you mentioned, will effectively be reaching that threshold of 40% debt to GDP. At that point, foreign investors will begin to look, what is going on? Like we mentioned before, they will begin, it will cause jitters, and that will actually reduce foreign investment. It will reduce economic activities and ultimately make Nigerians poorer. We really need to do something about this debt issue. We need, and in doing something about the debt issue, the way forward, in my opinion, and I'm sure Nairametrics has reported on this before, the way forward is actually growing the economy, investing in areas that will grow the economy. And once you are growing the economy, you will have outlets to generate revenue. Your tax revenue will increase. And once your tax revenue increase, you have enough money to settle your debt issues. And that will be the solution. But once the economy continues to, once we continue to plunge ourselves deeper into debt without getting the revenue that we need, it's going to be difficult. So we need to get more people to work. We need to expand the economy. We need to widen the tax net also, but expanding the economy will actually widen the tax net.
Yes. All right, Cees Harmon, I have to leave it there because of time, but in this year that it is, we're just wrapping up the first quarter of the year as it is now. There's a lot to come for Nigeria's largest economy, so many of us will be paying attention to that, and we look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you so much, Cees.
It's my pleasure.